evening. First, I'd like to thank the ES University and Sanjay Srivastava for giving us opportunity to share our thoughts and views on architectural history and theory. I would like to put forth three questions which are common, in architectural scenario, whether be in academics, be in practice. These questions are very common, very naturally bounded within our thought. The first question, why history is so important in general? Second question, what is theory in architecture? And third question is how history and theory are related. I hope to answer these three questions in some or other way, or at least I'll be able to articulate some areas which require some more close attention. So within the general understanding of history, there are several historians talked about history and its relevance in economic stream, political stream, social stream, cultural stream. And they all put forth their own definitions of what is history. So, for example, Indian historian, very well-known historian, D. Kosambi, he said that history is a transmission of acquired skills. I began to dissect this statement from architecture point of view. Perhaps there is some relevance in that. He was perhaps referring to cultural dimension in history, and maybe I was looking at how cultural dimension is related to architecture. Some historians said that history is a philosophy of ideas drawn from examples. Many other historians studied history from individual interest and contributed their respective discipline. For example, Karl Marx, he talked about history is nothing but material struggle. Conflict and class struggles are always related to surplus. It means society, when it generates surplus, the material struggle starts and the class struggle starts. That's a very socialistic way of looking at history. Perfect, that's fine. Then maybe a scientist would look at history more as a progress towards rationality. I was trying to see, add my definition to it, how it fits. Maybe we'll try to test it out. History is a sedimentation of time. I think when you said sedimentation, we immediately, have an image. And we understand the whole physical, chemical configuration of the word sedimentation very clearly. Hopefully, we'll be able to articulate that. And on my right-hand side, what you see is a miniature painting of Nardwara, maybe I think 15th to 16th century. This is a representation of simultaneous event in a given situation, maybe from the myth, maybe from the reality. But to me, these are very important drawings, the way reality and myths are represented and how architecturally these drawings are relevant. We will see it in next few slides. It is perhaps no slight exaggeration that architecture discipline would require perspective of history from many discipline views on history. Because architecture is a canvas that holds and manifests every single force that affects our existence. Hence, the study of history is not just philosophy drawn from example, but a course of action. History gives a course of action. It is also an acquired skill that brings about evolution of technology and architecture over a period of time. How they have influenced, how technology has really come about in given circumstances, and how they have shaped architecture over a period of time. Or how social and cultural construct of our reality has evolved and formed, or how reality is a sedimentation of thought and ideas that evolved in history and passed through the cultural scene. So sedimentation is I'm using more as a metaphor, more as a kind of a association in which architecture is perhaps uh, seen with more reflective ideas. History is a sedimented reality. Hence, sedimentation is an architectural concept. To me, sedimentation is a physiological phenomena. Yes, but sedimentation is an architectural concept because the way ideas settle down, they get embedded into your life. You exist in that idea. You develop new idea. Architecture is very dynamically trapped in this sedimentation process. The monolithic construction to a modular construction, you can see in the images, they're from Indian architecture, shore temples, and I think these buildings are from Hyderabad. So modular construction and monolithic construction, history helps us in theorizing the past for future action. Everything that we see in history is a product of physiological forces and psychological state of mind. Architecture will always remain product of this duality, the physiological force and psychological impact. Architecture has a lot to derive from. So this is the third slide of sedimentation that I spoke about. Yeah, I'll leave it for
Yes.
a second so you can read it.
Yes.
And this is the fourth slide where I talked about architecture and sedimentation, monolithic construction, modular construction.
Yes.
And this is where I was. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So we often study history with a timeline or a linear process. This is how we are taught history. We prescribe notation that history is about war and heroism. It's about fact and effects. This is perhaps a narrow way of theorizing history, very narrow way of looking at history. We often engage with second circumstances. We do that very often politically, socially. We try to make certain event historically real. And in that process, we don't realize that we are erasing the factual history. Mythical history is important as well, but at the same time, the factual history is also important. The third aspect is historiography, is a way in which you write and narrate history, is very important phase and step in architecture. But what is more important is the last phase where you develop those critical abilities, what I call it historicism, causes and imperatives. It means you engage with certain sense of objectivity about history. You engage your critical spirit and unbiased ways of writing history. That's how you look at history and build those large theoretical ideas. So now we have three things, which is a, triad relationship. One side you have history as we have defined. The other side is architecture, which is intellectual space construct for living. But we often perhaps not articulate what is contemporary. We use the word contemporary architecture, but we really don't dissect this word. So contemporary actually means the living and occurring at the same time. They coexist in simultaneity. We live our life with a lot of simultaneity. There are so many narratives we live together. Our social life is also embedded into so many different conditions, and we all live simultaneously. Somewhere it is, you oblige to kind of as a ritual. Somewhere you oblige to more of a customs. Somewhere you oblige with different things. So there is a contemporariness exists in every one of us. So if I read this, history is a contemporary architecture. If I use a term like that, it means history becomes more and more relevant. If I just start interpreting all this statement together, there is a more and more relevance that architecture can be conceptualized. So there are various ways architecture can be conceptualized. This is good for students who are attending this lecture. How do you really come to, come about developing architectural form? So there is a methodical transformation of form, architectural form. There is a biology of architectural form. Biology, I use the word because the seed becomes a plant and plant becomes a tree. It's a biology, the way it kind of matures. So architecture also derives its biology from various sources. So there are related forms that you deal with, and these related forms are nature, history, or architectural building. These are the natural forms that we respond to. And this kind of transformation, if you look at this as a source, these transformations are very natural and strong. It means if you try to imbibe nature, your architecture tend to become stronger. It has a stronger statement. If you look at architectural history, it gets more embedded. It means it's very natural and very strong way of doing it. But if you look at the in between two conditions, where one is a painting to buildings and narrative to buildings, this kind of transformations are forced and weak. That is because we have not developed substantial amount of maturity in our work. We have not moved from principal source of inquiry into a second and maybe higher level of inquiry. And this transformation remains weak. And many of you are good at sketching, drawings, and things like that. They develop very peculiar skills, which is analytical drawings. And once you engage with analytical drawings, that transformation is also very strong and natural, because drawing allows you to develop next drawing, and then you develop into a building. So there are two things that we talk about in this transformation process, how history gets transformed. So first is architectural thinking, and second is architectural knowledge. Architectural thinking is the way we perceive the world, the way we look at the world. All of us carry some kind of world view. Sometimes the world views are limited, sometimes world views are expanded because of your nature of exposure. So we engage into architectural thinking, and our cognitive process begins to react to the external reality. We see architecture and we react. We react based on our memory, we react based on our exposure to history, literature, and many other disciplines. And second is architectural knowledge, where your first reaction become conceptual response. You respond to that architecture. You engage your critical thought. You deconstruct that idea. So architectural knowledge is the way in which you analyze the architecture. You compare. When you see a building and you react that building has a good scale, it means you are comparing that with something. Or you say a building is a loftiness. It means you are comparing with some historical example in your mind. It means your architectural thinking and architectural knowledge are operationalized. What you see on the left-hand side is a drawing by John Haidu. Now, this drawing actually, when you look at it, is a flat axonometric. John Haidu was known for this kind of drawings, very unusual drawings and unusual architectural form. It's a flat axonometric, but it has a strong sense of history, because these are all derived from the way miniature drawings are. There is a sense of simultaneity. He tried to revive that sense of simultaneity through drawings. So when I talk about drawings, obviously the thing that comes to my mind is Renaissance architecture. There is a very strong history, intellectual revival of all the learnings of history, and they got resolved in certain quality of of architecture, certain quality of philosophical output, and so on and so forth. Renaissance architects started making drawings, what we call it, one-point perspective. The impact of that one-point perspective drawing was so powerful that even artists began to draw, paint with a one-point perspective in mind. The whole idea of one-point perspective is to look at anthropocentric architecture, which is architecture about people. So there is a sense of symmetry, suggested symmetry in the building. You can see the loftiness of barrel vault in the background. The man, you can see the two men in the center. This is very similar to Michelangelo's David in Florence, where Piazza Vecchio, where David his statue is there, and again he tried to look at the scale of architecture and the man. So whole idea of drawing, the act of drawing, is to essentialize your idea, distill your thought, or you manifest in a way you think are most appropriate, to the skill that you have. So through history, you develop the sense of drawing. Drawing is a kind of interface between what you imagine and what the projected reality would be. This is a drawing by James Stirling. This is way back in the 60s. He developed a very peculiar drawing of making axonometric, which is bottom from bottom. Generally, we draw from the top. And this kind of drawings reveal the centrality, the central idea of the building. In this drawing, I can see very important part. One is the structure. It supports the inclined building outward, and I can see a central space. And when I see this, that's the view of the courtyard. And drawing almost suggests that the center. Of course, this building is known to all of you. Why this building is so important? To me, there is no other building in India which comes close to this building in terms of its sense of embeddedness in it, to be an Indian architecture. Somewhere there is a remnants of traditional systems, the way traditional fabrics are constructed, in the way it embraces the modernity very boldly. But also at the same time, this building gives a sense of universal quality. It means it doesn't look traditional in one sense. It has certain sense of generosity. It means it holds people's imagination of what a good architecture should be. And this is one of the brilliant examples of Indian modern architecture. And if you trace back the way this was imagined, similarly the way those traditional mohallas and traditional fabrics are constructed, it is simply imbibed. The only thing which changed was the lake. The presence of lake allowed him to submerge the building to have a seamless view, and you have a fantastic building. This is another building which I visited recently in Edinburgh. This is Scottish Parliament. This is by Spanish architect Enric Miralles. He is no more, but this is one of his finest creation. He is known for making fuzzy drawings which are very fuzzy. It doesn't limit itself into a plan, because building becomes a part of landscape. And you can see you can see the numbers, so you can identify buildings, but you can see various parts of buildings which are just extended out, becoming a part of the surrounding context. Building is becoming part of landscape. So when I was walking around these buildings, one guy was jogging in this portion. I was wondering how such a secured building like Parliament is open for people, and one could just walk around almost everywhere. So there is a some sense of generosity, a sense of boldness. There is a sense of building which is becoming a landscape, or landscape becoming a building, and it almost replicates the Scottish landscape. Uh, and building sits in a very interesting situation. And he uses a lot of local artists, local craftsmen, and their work. He kind of embeds into a raw concrete walls and so various surfaces, and that kind of enlivens the building during the daytime. This is another building by Peter Eisenman, Galatian Museum. Very important building. It is at construction stage. Peter Eisenman looks at history a little differently. He looks at history as a fiction, series of fiction. He calls it City of Artificial Excavation. So this building was to design in a terrain with hills and stone quarries and things like that. He looks at those natural contour lines, natural formation of ridge lines in various parts of nature. He actually looks at that as a starting grid. And he digs into those grids and creates various pathways. You can see in the drawing. It's clearly showing, landscape, buildings and pathways. Very unusual architecture, very complex build form, and uses super high technology to construct building like that. But this is how kind of history begins to kind of interact with the contemporary and looks at architecture completely in a different format. Now, this chart is basically to show you various, learning process. Now, this does not represent 5 years in any way. This could be entire life. So we often confuse or various aspects of contemporary. For example, pictorial space, tactile space, and tectonic space. This comprises of spatial understanding, spatial language that you develop. Each has certain qualities. Pictorial space is used by the painter basically to create a three-dimensional space in a canvas. And tactile space is based on certain textural and light quality, while tectonic space is the way we construct. And there are responses which are emotive, there are responsive ideas, and there are cognitive responses to the way the spaces are constructed. And emotive responses are very basic. It's like a childlike wonder. You say wow, and the building, you look at, say wow, it's a very first reaction. But slowly you embed into various other tactile and tectonic understanding of buildings, and your responses slowly changes. Similarly, the conceptual understanding of architecture develops at the second stage when you begin to understand abstraction, which is actually essentializing your idea. Abstraction is actually physically removed, like the Bharat Bhavan. He hollowed out the building wherever he thought was necessary. And representation is the way you draw them. This is generally the way the process you understand the conceptual idea of architecture. And this is often it is confused abstraction, extraction, and representation. While problem solving, synthesizing, and design thinking, there are three different things. Problem solving, you solve the problem. You need something and you get that material, your problem is solved. Design is not just problem solving. Synthesizing is the way you put few things together. But design thinking is something you talk about. If I make this wall little taller, what happens? If I make this wall little wider, what happens? If I punctuate this wall, what happens? This is design thinking. It means it has an experience embedded into it. Similarly, skill, attribute, and value. Skills are something basic. You might have a skill of sketching, but that may not make you a great architect. Skill has to move forward to attribute. Because attribute allows you to engage your skill to a first stage understanding, the way you conceptualize, the way you inscribe, the way you, for example, the way you do the site analysis. That's an attribute. Or the way, I give an example like river. River is an attribute. So how would you draw a river? You know, it's a matter of skill. And how do you engage critical skills to draw the river or a nature? If river is an attribute, the values are the cards, the way you assign some value to it. And this is how criticality is developed. What you call it, opinion, objectivity, and critical. Very often, I mean, 99% of the time we are opinionated. And it's very easy to be judgmental, but you say if you want to really develop a critical skill through history, you need to develop objectivity. It means you have to move away from that and analyze. And critical is something where you talk about both the sides, positive, negative, simultaneously, and you begin to develop the first stage of critical learning. The second last is subject, discipline, and discourse. I did discuss history, historicity, and historicism, so I'll not go into detail. But a subject is something which is very intangible thing that you talk about. Discipline is you try to kind of dissect. You like a research kind of a thing. As a scientist or as an artist or an architecture discipline, you dissect that particular phenomena, and that becomes a discipline. And discourse is something where you try to cut across and look at the other discipline and start thinking how do you engage them. It becomes discourse. While methodology and paradigm is much higher level, I will not detail out now because this is for a maybe postgraduate and PhD level. But it is very advanced knowledge system, and one has to slowly graduate to this as we move forward in life. So usually in any situation, how do we see history? How do you operationalize history when you think about design? So there are usually 4 parts that we have, and I must confess that 95% of the institutes are only restricted themselves to the first part, which is architecture knowledge as a problem-solving inquiry. Very rationalist way of looking at it. I'm not saying it is not required, but this is the first stage. Architecture has to do something more than that. Architecture cannot be just a device which is resolved out of functionality. It needs certain aesthetic. It needs certain delight, and without aesthetic and delight, architecture does not exist. So architecture knowledge is a formal inquiry. You engage your tectonic skills through your various references. And third stage is where you begin to dissect the context. You try to look at the context and perhaps engage with the history and develop a methodical approach in development of the form. And the last stage, which is the advanced system, where you see architecture knowledge as a social, political, and cultural inquiry. So it means if any of your understanding becomes a discourse, moves from subject and move towards discourse, you moved into very advanced realm of architectural knowledge, and it's the most ideal situation because architecture becomes more generous, architecture becomes more democratic, architecture becomes more people oriented when you engage with these channels. So one building that I will show you that how a rationalist would analyze the building. He would draw this drawing and he would try to look at various ways through which you analyze the building: circulation, geometry, axis, structure, natural light, and additive subtractive form. But is that so? Is this how building was imagined? This is Barcelona Pavilion in 1937, designed by Mies van der Rohe. He comes from completely different background. He was inspired by suprematist artists from Russia. He was inspired to make a building which are anti-gravity in nature. He wanted to design a building which is precarious. He used very simple devices: walls, flat roof, a suspended plane, a very, very thin column, virtually invisible. There is a huge cutout in the building which captures the sky, and you have a water body which reflects the sky. So there are very simple elements, makes building more fragile. If you look at any suprematist art form, he has almost replicated that. So as I told you, that this channel of art form to architecture is the most difficult one. But you need maturity to understand and capitalize the essential part of paintings. So there is a difference, the way architect would see this building and the way a rationalist would analyze the building. This is another building by Louis Kahn. One on my left hand side is the analysis of the building, the way rational ideas would emerge. But on your right side, what you see is a plan of a building. I mean, when you look at the plan, it doesn't look very exciting enough. But point is not that. Point is that this building is the first experiment by Louis Kahn to look at the idea of served and servant spaces. How do we conceptualize architecture? By dividing program and assign values. So there is a sense of enclosedness, which is the servant spaces, which are all U-shaped columns. They are servant spaces. They are also structured. And the spaces which are released in the center are the served spaces. He could engage the loftiness of early classical architecture, Renaissance architecture. There is a strong historical reference to building like this. He experimented this at this scale, very small scale building. But he went on making these ideas, make large public buildings, large public architecture, which is IIM Ahmedabad and assembly building in Dhaka. So you can understand architects' obsession with the history is so necessary, at the same time so evident in a building like this. This is a Jewish bathhouse which he designed in 50s, and you can literally see the roof is almost detached from all the walls and only only attached at the corner. So there is a sense of light and loftiness which is simultaneously engaging. Otherwise, building would have been a very standard building, ground floor building. He also designed at the same time the house, Fisher House, which is a very important house because this building uh, uh, has certain qualities, I think, which is consistent in all the buildings that he has done, from bathhouse to various houses to assembly buildings. This is how the rational problem solving would be. But he was thinking something else. He was thinking house is a very, opaque kind of a monolithic form, um, like a monk's cell, like an introspective kind of a understanding of architecture. So he used dry rubble masonry as a plinth and then wooden construction on the top to create that sense of fragileness. But he hinged a lot on the sense of opaqueness. In release large cutouts is only, only situation where he thinks the space could capture the view outside. And I think this kind of quality of architecture, where you engage inside outside, is more important than purely looking at the rational ways of understanding buildings. This is Casa Malaparte. This was designed in 1937. One would wonder why I'm showing this building. If you look at the drawing, this is the lower floor, a living, all the bedroom units are here. And what you see, this is the upper floor, where living rooms and kitchens and everything are there. You can see the sides. It's a rocky terrain. Building is sitting just like a wedge. You can see these elevations. Why this building is so important? This building has a very important context. It's in Capri. It's facing the Mediterranean Sea. It's on a hillock with almost 270-degree sea view. Architect has not shied away from the fact of that there is a context to deal with. He derived this idea of terrace housing from Mediterranean historical architecture. What is important is not the house, but what is important is how the house would uh, would engage with the tradition of terrace housing. And what you see in the house is that is not the entry and thing like that, but the way you go up on the terrace in the wall, which almost holds the nature, almost suggesting the nature ends there and kind of, or nature begins from there. So it holds the view. It's a very suggestive, very metaphorical idea, very powerful, because when you are inside that circle wall and you face the sea, it's a very overwhelming kind of a response one would have, irrespective of whether you are an architect or not. I think without wall, this house would not have had that impact. Says very clearly. This is another house by Mario Bota, very important house he designed again way back in 60s. He worked with Louis Kahn. One can see large chunk of volumes, in the photograph, and house is approached from the top, very unusual way, and then you slowly go down. So as you go down, you capture the view of Alps. It's in the border, Italian and Switzerland border, and you can see a form. It's a very simple, straightforward cubic volume. But the process of extracting, again, I'm using word extracting. How do you extract the form? Where do you extract the form? And how does that extraction engages with the context? This is a brilliant example. This is another house which is designed in late 90s by Stephen Hall. Again, looking at some of these historical references of water dams. There's a water stream on the side, and he draws the parallel of water dams. And those water dams are the place where you hold all this services, and you have a roof which overflow go over the water dams like the aqueous space. And building derives its vocabulary in a very, very important metaphor of water and the wall. And this is how you really look at buildings in a given setting. This is a very important building. It's almost no building there, but this is by Robert Venturi. He was asked to design a building, restore the house of Franklin Benjamin, the first Prime Minister of America. He was asked to restore the house and build a museum. Means you restore the house and house becomes a museum. Well, Robert Venturi is not about just making these explicit decisions. He believed in complexity and contradiction, kind of a thing. He chose to remove the entire house, create a lattice system, just a profile of the house. And he submerged the entire museum below the ground. And he created a public plaza. So it means that you enter the house, it's like a ghost house. You walk through the house. You get a feel of the house. But it's a part of a public plaza. And museum is underground. So, and in this process, he gives back the space to the city, to the neighborhood, and makes architecture more relevant. Perhaps house would not have done the justice as much as the situation now. So now coming to understanding the theoretical ideas from the history, the history model and the theory model, when you take it to a design, when you look at the whole idea of, design project is a site and a problem, and then you tend to kind of understand the problem through lens of program. And then you employ certain very basic systems that you are taught, which is services, structure, and so on and so forth. You simply come to a form, some form. And these forms are absolutely has nothing to do with what site is about. Site maybe needs something else. So the problem solving ideas have huge limitations. It needs to, one needs to move away from that. So there is a second system of thought that I talk about, in most of my lecture, that uh, how do we deal with this idea of history as an inquiry, theory as a way of moving forward? The best possible, I ask myself, even I'm sure second year, third year students can ask themselves, what is my interest in architecture? What is that I want to do in architecture? I think moment you ask this question, you begin to engage with some kind of a discipline. You engage with some discourse, whether social, political, historical, theoretical, disciplinary, whatever, or a formal, form making itself. But moment you say, what is my interest? Once that question comes, your system and pattern becomes much larger. They tend to ask much larger question. Of course, you are expected to do when you are in fourth year, fifth year. If you some students get it at early stage, which is very good. So if you get into that mode, your architecture is far more provocative, thought provocative, more projective in nature, more generous in nature, because more people oriented. It means that architecture is not just about function, but architecture is about the way people see things, people perceive buildings. Because buildings going to stay for many years, maybe 2 generations or 3 generations, we'll see that building. And this is how history is constructed. So I come back to same argument, rationalist, approach, tectonic approach, methodical approach, discursive approach. If you look at the, various categories of thought, which is formal integrity, even the way the form is, you talk about structure in your architecture, you talk about environmental issues in architecture, starting with climatology. Reds are the most undesirable, grays are so-so, and greens are the most desirable. You can look at it, the tectonic and methodical approach are far more superior in terms of the way you look at architecture, because there is a strong formal integrity, there is a structural integrity, and there is an environmental thing, especially in methodical approach. You look at the site, look at the history, there is a sense of environmental integrity. Even simple thing like the use of certain traditional material, use the way the material is used, historically. Moment you start doing that, there is a environmental integrity automatically embedded into that condition. So this is the most desirable path. And as you see, the color dots, if you look at rationalist approach, you come to a very application based understanding. But tectonic approach, you move your path and come to this blue dot. So it's a very, your forms are very high tech and high key in nature. Methodical approach, through history, context, you develop a very low key and low tech architecture, which is most desirable. Every architecture cannot be heroic in quality. And reds are the most undesirable, or perhaps it requires more skill to maneuver your path. So from the student point of view, one should always look at this as a way of engaging your research, your design. And this is the last slide. Now this is important slide because this summarizes the entire lecture. So there are two axes, x-axis and y-axis. X-axis is about the scale. Design works on various scale. As you move towards right, it moves towards small aspects of design, product designs and furniture designs and things like that. So it's a design domain, very strong design, but it has a scale. As you move towards left side, it's anthropological domain. It means you are addressing city, society at large. You're engaging large scale, anthropological kind of understanding. While if you move towards vertical scale, which is norms, there are norms set by society, norms set by policy, norms set by various other standards. And there is another domain which is a downward, which is the technological domain. where you tend to look at technology as a driving force. Architecture circle is try to balance it out. Not that every time we able to do that. Whenever you set your ideas, learn things about history and try to imbibe, try to find, put a dot there and locate where you are. And this will help you to understand the gap in the knowledge that you have, that what is that you need to kind of, learn about. And you have to do it very objectively. You need to detach from yourself. You look at yourself very objective and put very, honestly put a dot that, okay, my idea is more about, you know, policy domain or norms kind of a thing. And I need to bring human dimension into it. How do I do it? And I think this will allow you to develop a very conscious design process, very conscious individual, thinking about architecture, and implementing various architectural understanding, as you move forward in design discipline. Thank you.